In Chapter 11, we explore the issue of unemployment. One of the things I'll say about this chapter is it's a lot of definitions and terms, and I think those are really important. There's a lot that's misunderstood about unemployment and what unemployment, how economists understand the concept of unemployment, how we measure it, so on. So I want to walk through that fairly quickly, talk a little bit about what the weaknesses or at least limits are of some of those measures. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the idea of labor force participation, which is an important concept as well. And we'll expand on the last section of the chapter, which talks about women's growing labor force participation rates, and in the particular case in the chapter, the relationship to the pill. But I want to expand that out a bit over the course of the whole 20th century and talk some about women's role. First, let me suggest that the most important visual image in this entire chapter is figure 11.1. It's also in the PowerPoint on slide number 4. And one of the interesting things about this image, when I saw it in a textbook, I thought, wow, that's right, but if I had done it, I would have flipped it upside down and sort of done it the other way. So I'm going to talk through it really quick and do it sort of from the bottom up, right? So one of what we do as economists when we think about unemployment is we start with the entire U.S. population, okay? And we say, look, who are we talking about when we talk about the employed and unemployed? Well, first, we take some people out of the population that we're not going to talk about. Children, right, basically under the age of 16. We take out military personnel who are not relevant to this question of employment as we think about it traditionally. And then we also take out what we call institutionalized others. So folks in prison, in other situations where long-term hospitalization perhaps, where they simply can't possibly participate, okay? And then we say of that group, right, which is we usually refer to as the non-institutionalized population, right? We say, okay, are you in or out of the labor force? And what does that mean? That means, are you currently, do you currently have a job, or do you want a job, are looking for a job, and can't find one? Those are the two big categories. Either you have a job, or you'd like a job, you're looking for one, but yet you can't find one, okay? Everybody else, people who don't have jobs and aren't looking for jobs, aren't interested in working, are considered not in the labor force. Now, who would that be, right? There's some obvious examples that come to mind. Stay-at-home parents, right? People who've chosen to stay home and take care of, say, their kids or their parents, for that matter, and who have chosen that as their preferred use of their time. So if you are a mom or a dad and you're staying at home with kids, not looking for a job, not interested in working, taking care of the kids, you are, the way we would say it, you are not in the labor force. If you change your mind, or if you're, let's say you're staying home with the kids for a couple of years, or maybe till they get off to pre-K or kindergarten, and then you're going to go back in the labor force, or back to work. When you go back to work, we'd say you're back in the labor force. You're either going to have a job or you're going to be looking for a job. So that split between in the labor force and out of the labor force is really important. And the difference is you're out of the labor force if you're just not interested in working. Retirees are another one, right? If you're retired, you're done, you're not interested in having a job. The interesting thing here is that we don't think about retirees and stay-at-home parents, for example, as being unemployed, or we shouldn't. And in fact, economists don't consider them to be unemployed. And we've already kind of gotten to what the key distinction between employed and unemployed is. That is, obviously, if you're employed, you have a job, right? And you're good to go. Unemployed, for economists, means you're in the labor force. That is, you're interested in working, right? You'd like to work. Maybe you have a job, maybe you don't, but you want to work. If you're unemployed, you want to work, but cannot find a job. That's what it means to be unemployed. Unemployed does not mean you don't have a job. It means you'd like to have a job. You're interested in working, but you don't have one. Okay? So again, retirees, stay-at-home parents are not unemployed. Instead, we say of them, they're simply not in the labor force. They're not interested in working. Okay? So when we calculate, say, the unemployment rate, what we do is we add up the number of unemployed people, that is, people in the labor force who can't find a job, and we divide it by the total number of people in the labor force. So that if we say the unemployment rate is 5%, that means 5% of the people who want jobs don't have them and are unemployed. And it also means, by the way, that 95% of the people who want to work have a job, right? If the unemployment rate is 5%, the employment rate is 95%. The labor force, the total labor force, is completely taken up by the unemployed and the employed. That's who's in the labor force. And the other point, and we'll again get to this later, is you can break down the labor force by race, gender, other markers of demography. So we can talk about a female labor force participation rate and say what percentage of women, of the entire population of women, are in the labor force. We can talk about a female unemployment rate and say what percentage of women in the labor force are unemployed. We can do that with African Americans, Hispanics, whatever, however, by age, however we want to break it down. Right? And there's all kinds of interesting data and research on the particulars about labor force participation rates, employment, unemployment rates among those various demographic groups. So that's another thing that we can do with this data and this way of thinking about unemployment and employment. So again, that figure on figure 11.1 or on number 4 on the slides here, I think is really the key to understanding this chapter. And you can think about it the way they have it presented, or you can, as I did, sort of work from the bottom up and say, all right, we have the total population. How do we narrow it down to understand what we mean by employed or unemployed? The book also discusses the 3 major types of unemployment, and these are important, and I want to at least say a word or two about each of them. First, we talk about frictional unemployment. By frictional unemployment, we just refer to the fact that markets are dynamic and change. A restaurant closes, people lose their jobs. They have to go search for new jobs. Right? And then for some period of time, they will be unemployed. We'll never have zero unemployment. We just won't. An economy with zero unemployment is one in which businesses never fail. Is that what we want? Right? Where businesses never decide they need more workers or fewer workers, right? So the dynamics of competition and of an ever-changing market economy are such that firms go in and out of business. People just quit their jobs because they get tired or bored or want something different. That's all frictional unemployment. The second category is what we call structural unemployment. The best way, I think, to understand this is sort of mismatches between the skills of workers and the demands of firms. And also part of structural unemployment is sort of the longer-term unemployment that can be caused by poor institutions and poor policies. So one example of structural unemployment might be as we move more and more to a technological economy, as let's say people lose their jobs in construction or other sorts of physical manual labor and have to learn new skills to be able to compete, designing websites or whatever it might be. Right, at the time it takes them to develop those new skills, they're going to find it difficult to find a job, and we think of that as being structural unemployment. Different from frictional, right, where they have the skills, it just takes time, right? But structural unemployment is something of this sort of mismatch. The other, again, kind of structural unemployment is where regulations cause a problem. The book has a great discussion of the reasons that the unemployment rate in Western Europe is so much higher than in the US, which has to do with, for example, the relative height of their minimum wage law compared to median wages, and in particular, the ways in which their labor markets are regulated very different from ours, and the much more strong power of collective bargaining and unions over contracts, and how much more difficult it is in, say, Western Europe to fire a worker that you're not pleased with. One analogy to think about there is if it's more difficult to fire workers, you are less likely to hire workers in the first place. If it's more difficult to get divorced from someone, you're less likely to marry them in the first place. Or one way to think about it is if you had to marry someone after 3 dates, no matter what, right, you'd be hesitant about taking that 3rd date. And if you had to marry them and couldn't divorce them, right, even more so. So job regulations that make it hard to fire workers or make it mandatory that workers get hired after a certain point in time, right, make it less likely. They raise the cost of hiring workers and firms are less likely to hire them in the first place. That leads to greater unemployment. There's a whole bunch of reasons we see that in Western Europe. I should also add, in the United States, one of the reasons we see higher unemployment rates among low-skilled workers and other similar groups is because we do have a lot of regulations in the United States that make it difficult for them to work, minimum wage being one of them, but occupational licensure laws, zoning regulations, limits on how you can operate a business out of your house, all of those make it hard for folks with lower skills to get into the entry level labor market. So structural unemployment is part of that too. And then finally, what we call cyclical unemployment, which is the unemployment we associate with the business cycle, right? So when we go into a recession, we see unemployment climb. The unemployment that's due to the, say, lack of mismatch in loanable funds that leads to the recession, right, or other policies that might lead to the recession. The Fed having, say, overexpanded credit. All of those things, right, that lead to the recession sort of are causes of that cyclical unemployment. So frictional, structural, cyclical unemployment. Those are the three biggies that we talk about. So let me say a few words about women and labor force participation rates. As I said, the book has a nice